Amazon has required dietary supplements to have lab testing for a long time, but the process has recently changed. In the past, sellers could usually submit a certificate of analysis or COA from any ISO 17025 accredited lab. Now Amazon is requiring brands to go through their approved testing, inspection, and certification providers instead. And instead of the seller submitting the documentation, the lab submits the verification directly to Amazon. In this video, I'm going to walk you through what the real price ranges for supplement testing are right now, how Amazon's new partner lab verification process actually works, what happens if your product already has testing from another lab, and how much it costs to have that COA validated instead of repeating the testing. And some of the price differences between labs are actually pretty surprising. In some cases, we've seen quotes as low as $250, while others are closer to $1,000 for the exact same product. And if your product already has the testing, the cost might only be around $80. Amazon has required dietary supplements to have third-party lab testing for many years, just like most other major retailers. But historically, Amazon hasn't always enforced those requirements consistently. Several times, Amazon has announced new supplement compliance policies, and sometimes those policies would take a long time to actually get enforced. Often it seems like the official policy on Amazon's website doesn't fully match the real process or procedures brands actually end up going through. The current policy around working with Amazon-approved testing providers started appearing around 2024. At that time, it seemed to only apply primarily to certain supplement categories, such as weight management, sexual wellness, and sports nutrition. Brands selling these products in those categories started receiving notifications that they needed to go through one of Amazon's approved testing, inspection, and certification providers, often called TICs. But if a brand received the notification and their product was not actually intended for one of those categories, they could sometimes explain to Amazon and the requirement would be removed. More recently, the wording in Amazon's policy has changed, and now it appears that the requirement is expanding to more types of supplements across the whole category. However, the rollout still doesn't appear to be completely uniform. For example, among the supplement brands we work with, only 1 out of about every 6 brands has actually been requested to complete the full TIC verification process so far. So as of right now, it appears Amazon is gradually expanding enforcement rather than requiring it for every supplement. For most brands, the process begins when Amazon sends a product compliance notification. You'll receive a message saying, submit product safety documentation to avoid listing deactivation, and the issue will appear in account help. The notification will show the affected product and give you a deadline to complete the verification. From what we've seen so far, Amazon usually gives sellers a couple of months. For one client, they received the notification on December 17th with an initial deadline of February 23rd. As the deadline approached, Amazon actually moved the deadline back to March 27th, so the timeline was extended. So brands usually do have some time to complete the process, but it's still something they need to be aware of and be ready to move quickly once you get the notification from Amazon. Once the notification appears in Account Health, you open the compliance issue and select Verify Your Product, and Amazon will show you a list of their approved TICs. After you select a provider, Amazon generates something called a Test Request Form, or TRF. You provide that TRF to the lab you're working with. From that point forward, the lab guides the rest of the process, either reviewing your existing testing documentation or performing new testing if it's required. Once the testing and verification is complete, the lab submits the results directly to Amazon. At this point, you might be wondering, what testing do we actually need to do? The good news is that in most cases, you don't actually need to understand all the technical details behind the testing yourself. That's the job of the TIC provider. These labs specialize in supplement testing, and they already know what Amazon expects to see. So once you send them the test request form and the information about your product, they will determine what testing is required. In general, the testing is meant to confirm a few basic things. First, that the ingredients listed on the label are actually present in the product. Second, that the amounts of those ingredients match what the label claims. Those are standard tests that most supplement brands are already performing anyway. However, there are certain supplement categories that Amazon specifically calls out for additional testing requirements. If you're selling supplements intended for bodybuilding, joint health, sexual enhancement, sports nutrition, and weight management, then Amazon's policy says they have to also be tested for heavy metal and microbial contaminants. They may also require pesticide testing. I know we have had some brands who didn't have this additional testing already, and they had to do those additional tests specifically to meet Amazon's requirements. There is also one detail brands should pay attention to. Amazon's automated systems often look at the language used in your product listing when determining what type of product the supplement is. So if your listing claims benefits related to those things, bodybuilding, joint health, sexual enhancement, sports nutrition, or weight management, the system may categorize the products into one of those groups, and then you'll have to do the additional testing. So unless those benefits are actually central for what the product's intended for, it's usually better not to say anything about those topics unless you've already done the testing and you want to be able to talk about those topics in the listing. Separate from that, all dietary supplements also need a CGMP certificate from the manufacturer. When it comes to the cost of this process, there are really two different situations. The first situation is where the TIC provider needs to perform the testing themselves. The second situation is where the product already has testing completed and the TIC provider just needs to review and certify the existing certificate of analysis. One of our clients recently requested quotes from several approved TIC providers for the exact same product and the exact same testing scope. They contacted 5 different labs. Most of the quotes came back around $500 to $1,000 per product. But one provider, Intertech, quoted them at $250 for the same testing. That just shows how the different labs can charge very different prices for the same work, which is why it's good to request quotes from multiple providers. Intertech happened to be the lowest quote in that example, but because Intertech is currently charging a much lower price than the others, they might end up getting busier and maybe they start taking way too long or they raise their prices soon. When a TIC provider is performing the testing themselves, the quotes we've seen are typically in that $500 to $1,000 range, with Intertech being lower at $250. Anything above $1,500 seems to be uncommon. If that testing was already done and otherwise met Amazon's requirements, the TIC provider doesn't necessarily need to redo the testing. They may be able to simply review and validate the existing COA and confirm with Amazon that the product is approved to sell. If another lab did the testing, it is really important that that lab has the ISO 17025 accreditation. If they don't, the testing will have to be redone. However, that certification is really common. Most of the time with our clients that already had testing done before selling on Amazon, their testing was done by a lab with that certification already. When the TIC only needs to review and certify an existing COA, the cost is much lower. You can usually pay $80 to $120 per product for that kind of validation. But of course, you still have to pay the original lab for the actual testing. Now let's talk about how long the process actually takes. The exact timeline can vary, of course, but I'll give you a pretty good estimate of what to expect. First, once you contact a TIC provider and send them the test request form, they will review the request and confirm the testing scope. That initial review can take a few business days. If the TIC provider is going to perform the testing themselves, the next step is sending them product samples. Once they receive the samples, the lab performs the required testing panels. For most supplement products, that testing process usually takes somewhere around 3 to 4 weeks. After the testing is completed, the TIC provider submits the results directly to Amazon. Usually the total timeline for testing and verification ends up being somewhere around 4 to 6 weeks. Although when this first started, I know a lot of labs were taking a lot longer than that, but it seems to have gotten better. So that timeline usually works as long as you get started when you receive the notification. Once you send your samples to the lab, the TIC can mark your product as in progress. At that point, Amazon says they won't pull down your listing at the deadline if the testing is not completed yet. However, if the lab is not able to validate your documents or the product doesn't pass testing the first time, the listing will be removed immediately. So it's nice that there's some extra flexibility. If your product already has testing from another ISO accredited lab, the timeline can be much shorter because the TIC provider may only need to review and validate the existing COA. In that case, the entire process may only take a week or two instead of 4 to 6 weeks. Now, testing is only one of the costs brands run into when selling on Amazon. If you're researching what it takes to sell supplements on Amazon, testing isn't the only cost you need to understand. Amazon actually charges a lot of different fees, and several of those fees changed in 2026. So whether you're new to Amazon or you've been selling there for years, it's really important to understand how those fees work and what your business will actually be paying. I break down all the Amazon fees and the recent changes so you can see the full picture of what it costs to sell on Amazon. Click here to watch that next.